The movie begins with a satellite capsule named Pilgrim in space, moving at a rapid rate. Then we see the International Space Station hovering above Earth as the sun rises over the horizon. Inside the ship, Dr. Miranda, the quarantine officer, tells the command center that the Pilgrim capsule is returning with samples it has collected from the surface of Mars. But Pilgrim was damaged and is not on the right course to be received by them, so they have to use a robot arm to grab it as it passes by them. Rory Adams, the man who'll grab the Pilgrim capsule, is getting suited up to go outside. David floats off to grab a pad and runs into show on his way back. Everyone is nervous about the mission, except Rory. In the control room, Ekaterina, the mission commander, is there with Miranda, and they get ready for the impact of the Pilgrim. Rory now has control of the robot arm as Sho watches out the window. Hugh then meets Miranda by the window because he believes in Rory making the catch. It's time now. Everyone waits in suspense for Rory to make the catch. They can see it in the distance now, and Rory just barely makes the catch, and they are all relieved. In the lab, Hugh is preparing the Mars samples to look under a microscope. He finds a small fossilized cell. He is sure that it was alive at one point and has everything a coal would need to have. They raise the temperature trying to wake up the cell, but nothing. Hugh wants to try something and matches the air inside the container to that of Earth. And just like that, the cell starts to wake up. They have confirmed that life has existed on other planets other than Earth. After a while, Ekaterina is answering questions from Earth from some school children. She even tells them that David has been in space for 473 days now and is about to break the record for the longest stay. They go around with the camera showing the kids how life is like outside of Earth in space. The kids are going to give the alien cell a name, and with everyone watching, they call the Martian cell Calvin. After some time, Rory and Hugh are fixing the shower, and David is with Miranda, and she is checking out his physical condition. He is close to his limit, since he's been here for a long time. He seems to want to stay here, rather than go back to Earth. Hugh is looking at his legs, as he is paralyzed, and that's why he loves it up here. Ekaterina appreciates him, and tells him so, as they all fall asleep after a hard day's work. The next day, Calvin grew rapidly. According to Hugh, the cells have come together to become one entity. Miranda concludes that this isn't different individuals, but rather a single organism collected into one. All the cells can do every function by themselves and act like every other cell with no speciality. They are all muscle, nerve, and photoreceptor cells at the same time. Hugh thinks that Calvin can now interact with the outside environment. As the rest watch on, Hugh sticks a finger inside the container, and Calvin reaches out towards him as well. They're surprised that Calvin is not scared of Hugh. As they watch on while Hugh plays with Calvin, it starts to grow more appendages. Later on, they're all together in the canteen joking and laughing. Sho is on his own looking through a screen of his wife giving birth to his baby. Back in the canteen, they laugh at David for the way he reads a book, and Sho introduces them to his new baby and wife. Later, David is checking out his movement, and who is looking at his new family. It all seems so peaceful on the ship as Hugh is playing with Calvin again. Ike climbs onto his finger and he brings it closer to him as Miranda watches on. Suddenly an alarm is called and they all rush in because it is coming from the lab. Hugh forgot to lock the lab up properly, and now he is confronted by Rory and Miranda to always triple check the exits when he goes in or out of the lab. Rory doesn't like that Hugh is getting emotionally attached to Calvin. Miranda reports that Calvin has now become inactive, but they don't know the true reason why, but she thinks it's because Hugh forgot to lock the door to the chamber properly. Hugh is angry with himself for causing Calvin to get into this hibernation state. Later on, while Miranda is examining him, Hugh tells her that he's been thinking of stimulating Calvin with electricity. He tries to convince her by telling her all the things they can learn from Calvin by keeping it alive. In the lab, Hugh gets an electric rod for Calvin, and the rest watch on from outside. On his first attempt, there is nothing. So he tries again, but this time, it wakes up and grabs him. Hard. So hard that it broke the rod. He has to pull out his hand without damaging the glove. Hugh pulls hard, but he can't seem to be strong enough to pull his hand free from Calvin. Hugh tries to relax, but Calvin is getting a firmer grip on his hand. Rory wants to go in and get Hugh out, but Miranda is not having it. Hugh tries to distract it with the rod. Calvin is not buying it. It even starts to grip harder on his hand. It squeezes tighter until it starts breaking Hugh's fingers. As they all argue outside, Calvin lets go, and Hugh pulls out his mangled hand from the box and passes out. Calvin is now trying to escape through the glove, but goes back inside to get the rod and uses it to rip a hole through the glove and escape. They see it darting around the lab, and it finds the rat. Calvin wraps around the rat and digests it pretty quickly. Rory has had enough and jumps into the lab to rescue Hugh. As he pulls him out, Calvin catches Rory on his leg, and David locks the door before either of them can escape. Rory understands that he can't get out while Calvin is on his leg, so he decides to use an oxygen candle to burn off Calvin. Calvin then jumps off his leg and onto the wall. Rory wants to kill it, and Ekaterina gives him permission. Sho tells him to use the flamethrower, so he grabs it and chases Calvin across the room, trying to kill it with flames. He can't catch it, and he's wasting too much fuel. Rory can't find Calvin, and without anyone noticing it, jumps on his back and gets inside his mouth. Calvin starts to kill Rory from the inside, as the rest watch on helplessly. The flamethrower then floats towards a sensor and triggers the fire alarm, and Ekaterina and Sho rush to turn it off, but a much bigger Calvin emerges from Rory's mouth and is trying to escape through the fire extinguisher ducts. They go one by one, but Calvin beats them to it and escapes. Later that day, they wrap up Rory's body, and Ekaterina tells ground control that Calvin has escaped their quarantine, and they have decided to find and destroy it because it has become deadly. But the message doesn't look like it went out to the ground control. They have to go outside to fix the issue, and Ekaterina is the most qualified for it, so she is the one who has to do it. David gets her ready, and she instructs him to keep Calvin from reaching Earth regardless of what happens to any of them. Ekaterina is now outside, and she makes her way to the transmitter. She finds out it has overheated and thinks Calvin has gotten into the coolant. She opens it up and finds it empty, and while she is talking to them, Calvin suddenly jumps out and grabs onto her. Miranda looks out to her and sees how big Calvin has gotten attached to Ekaterina's suit, and it's gotten much bigger. It's trying to get in because it can't breathe in space. She closes the valve so he can't go back inside, so now it's squeezing her leg. David decides to go to the airlock to save her. Calvin broke her coolant hose, and now she's got water inside of her suit. She now can't see where she's going as she heads towards the airlock. She has to jump to get there, so she detaches herself from the ship and leaps to the airlock and manages to catch herself at the other end, but she's basically drowning right now in her own suit. David is inside getting ready to go out to get Ekaterina. She gets to the lock, but then she holds the lock down to keep herself and Calvin outside, as it gets even bigger now. She holds the lock in place despite David asking her to open it to let her in. She wants to end it by sacrificing herself to kill Calvin. David begs her, but she has made up her mind. She floats away as they cry because their commander has died. Soon after, Hugh asks Sho about the communications, and they are still out. David takes off his suit and checks outside but can't see Calvin. They then figure out that the only way it can get back into the ship is through the thrusters. They can fire them and blast Calvin, but they'd have to know which thruster first. They follow it across the ship, firing the thrusters along its path, and it's jumping through the outside of the ship. But now they are running out of fuel, and now they have gotten themselves below their orbit and will fall into Earth soon. They can't risk Calvin falling back to Earth with them, so they decide to keep Calvin out of Earth no matter what. Calvin is now inside the ship, so Sho uses the rest of the fuel to get back into orbit. Hugh then figures out that Calvin's species has gone into hibernation because of the toxic atmosphere on Mars, and if they can recreate that here, then they have a chance at stopping it from surviving. They just have to figure out where it is and lure it towards where they want it to go. They start sweeping from opposite directions, and Hugh thinks he spotted Calvin. Sho is covering the vents with Miranda, and she notices the distress on Hugh's face. David is reminded about other space tragedies, and he is clearly traumatized by having to watch his colleagues die. Hugh recites some poetry, and they even have a laugh, and they keep each other from blaming themselves about letting Calvin out. Hugh then mentions that Calvin isn't doing this out of hate. It is only doing this to survive. Either Calvin or them must die in order for the other to survive. Hugh almost passes out, but they manage to catch him. He then collapses, and they have to revive him. They prepare the defibrillator, but there is no response from Hugh, no matter how much they try. But then, Miranda notices something moving on Hugh's leg. Calvin has attached itself to Hugh's leg and has been feeding on him this whole time. Miranda shocks it off his leg, and it has grown so much that they need to run away from it. It chases after them, so Sho leads it away from David and Miranda and locks himself into the sleeping pod. Calvin looks for a way into the pod, but it is sealed shut, so it leaves Sho alone. Miranda and David make their way back to Hugh, and he is still alive, but as they lift him up, he runs out of energy and passes away in Miranda's arms. Only 3 of them are left now, and must find a way to kill it. That's when David spots Calvin on the 3D map. It has ingested Hugh's tracker, and now they can see exactly where it is in the ship. Calvin finds Hugh again and starts to feed on him, but soon it jumps towards them, but they lock the door just in time. They drop the oxygen level in that section, and they can see Calvin panicking inside that section. Then suddenly, they get a proximity alert. There is a rescue ship outside coming to save them, but the ship has no idea what is going on inside the ISS. And to make things worse, they are landing from the side of the ship where Calvin is located. David tries to contact them using a flashlight, but they can't see, and they attach to the ISS. David has no idea what is going on, and Miranda tells him, "This is the last line of defense. They aren't here to rescue them. They are here to push the ISS into deep space because they can't risk Calvin reaching Earth." This was her plan all along. Sho thinks they are here to save them, so he jumps out of his pod and makes his way towards the airlock. He opens the door, and Miranda races after him to stop him. Sho gets to the airlock, but Calvin is close behind. He manages to open the lock, but Calvin follows him inside as the ship pushes the ISS into deep space. The ship starts to detach from the ISS, and the pressure change starts to suck out the air, and people from the ISS, including Calvin. Miranda has Sho's hand, Calvin, hanging onto Sho's leg. When Calvin climbs up their arm, Sho decides to sacrifice himself and grabs Calvin and lets go of her arm to go out into space with it and kill them both. But Calvin has escaped Sho and starts to climb back through the airlock following them. Miranda and David make it back inside, and they see the ISS getting destroyed by the rescue ship that's malfunctioning. They check how much air they have left, and that's when David sees that the rescue ship has knocked them back into Earth's gravity. They only have 39 minutes before they fall into the atmosphere, and they will not survive the heat as they go in, but Calvin might. As they were preparing for death, an idea hits David. He can lure Calvin with the oxygen candle into an emergency lifeboat and use it to fly out into deep space with Calvin inside manually. And Miranda will be in the other lifeboat and escape back to Earth. David's plan works, and Calvin follows him into the lifeboat, and he locks them both inside as Miranda gets into the other lifeboat. David's lifeboat takes off into space, and her lifeboat follows right after. David starts to steer away from Earth as he fights for control with Calvin. Calvin eventually wins out and overwhelms David and takes over his body as the lifeboat flies off into space. Miranda's lifeboat is struggling to stay on course, and eventually it hits the atmosphere. The lifeboat falls into the ocean and is rescued by some fishermen who look inside and see the lifeboat that has David and Calvin inside, and not Miranda. She was the one flying into deep space. Calvin finally made it to Earth, and despite David screaming out to the fishermen, they open the door and free the alien from Mars onto Earth.